Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome to Hong Kong U. Welcome to another edition of our Hong Kong U, Hong Kong Baptist U joint seminar series on European politics. My name is Roland Vogt, and I'm the head of school of the School of Modern Languages and Cultures. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all tonight here to talk about Germany's recent parliamentary elections. I would also want to welcome all of the people joining us online. We're streaming this via Zoom, and we will also have participants asking questions. We want to make the session as lively and as engaging and interactive as we can. And we will also, check on questions on the chat. So for those participants who are joining us online, please use the chat function to already post questions, and then we can sort of select them as we go along. Please allow me 1 minute to introduce our very distinguished speakers here tonight. I'll go from left to right. And first is Ms. Katrin Bode. Ms. Katrin Bode is a representative of the German Academic Exchange Service here in Hong Kong. And she's a visiting scholar at the Department of Government and International Studies at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Prior to coming to Hong Kong, she served at the University of Tianjin in China from 2015 to 2019, and previously had teaching positions both at the University of Bonn and the University of Cologne in Germany. Next is Professor Alistair Cole. He's the head of department and professor of European politics at the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. Prior to coming to Hong Kong, he ran the Institute of Political Studies in Lyon in France from 2015 to 2019. And prior to that, he was professor of European politics at Cardiff University. He read for his DPhil at Oxford at Balliol College. Next is Axel Heinrich Sievers, who is the country director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. For those of you who might not be familiar, the German political parties all have a political foundation that are active both inside and outside of Germany. It's a very unique model, and the Heinrich Böll Foundation is the one that's closest affiliated with the Green Party. He has been country director in Hong Kong. He only came to Hong Kong fairly recently, so a warm welcome to Hong Kong. Prior to his arrival in Hong Kong, he was country director for the foundation in Burma. In India, he led the regional office for the foundation in East Africa based in Nairobi, and he was country director also for the office in Nigeria in Lagos. He's a historian and political scientist by training and received his PhD in African studies from the University of Hanover.
Long time ago.
Last but not least, Dr. Florian Knote. He's the director of the University Museum and the Art Gallery here at University of Hong Kong. He's associate professor of art history in our Department of Art History. Prior to Hong Kong, he worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and the Corning Museum, where he oversaw the East Asian and European departments. He read for his PhD at the Gutenberg University in Mainz and did his MA in the Courtauld Institute of Art at UCL London. I would also like to thank our support staff, Evelyn Lowe, who was responsible for posters and PR, Dorothy Shum for the administrative work, and our technical team, Hin, who's been helping me with Zoom calls and all kinds of technical things, so a big thanks to you as well. What I would like to do is to just kickstart a very brief question, and then we sort of go along and open it up. For those of you who might be familiar with the German media scene, you'll see that it's like the talk shows are really where debates happen, and there's plenty of different formats. So what we wanted to do is to replicate this as best as we can here in Hong Kong and have people from different walks of life looking at what is going on in Germany, what is happening in German society, and what these results of the recent election tell us. So I would like to start with Axel Heinrich Sievers and asking you, were you surprised by the results at all? It's on.
The
It's
mic is
It's
on, yeah.
automatically on. Yes.
No, I was not surprised. I was relieved. I must say, as representative of a foundation that is kind of linked to the Green Party. Of course, I was happy that the Green Party got 14.8%, which is a proper, I think, 60% increase compared to the last elections. At the same time, it was very clear that the development over the last few months was kind of pretty much downwards. That the opinion polls by earlier in this year, in April, when Annalena Baerbock was made the chancellorship candidate of the Greens, for the first time the Greens really presented a chancellorship candidate. When that was done in April, the opinion polls went very high, up to 25%, and we were all getting a bit worried that the downward trend resulting from certain factors, some mistakes, some also misogyny, I believe, that led to this kind of falling opinion poll figures, that this may go worse, that this could become worse. 15% is pretty good. I mean, but there's this perception that the Greens actually are the winners of this election, which is in a way true, but also the Social Democrats, of course, won this election. And this is the actual real surprise. For me, that is what really surprised many of us, that the Social Democrats came out of a long-drawn, low level of, in the low level on the opinion polls, and they suddenly made it to become the strongest party again with something like 25%, and this deserves some closer analysis, I think. Great. Which I'm not going to do now, I suppose.
Yeah, we will.
It's a pity that we don't have a representative from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Hong Kong, who right. Is the foundation affiliated to the Social Democrats. Yeah.
This border, do you like the results showed that young people in particular, and in particular first-time voters, voted a lot for the Greens and the Liberals, which is quite different from what it used to be in the past. Why do you think they went for those parties? And what kind of message does this tell us about a young generation in Germany?
First of all, I think that it's the Green Party. The young people have been voting for the Green Party for a couple of elections, so this is not the surprise. The surprise for me was that about 23% of all young people voted for the Liberals, right? This is, I think, it's because usually the Liberals are very much connected to free market economy and conservative values and very, neoliberal. And I think, and actually I asked a couple of youngish people, and the Green Party has not managed to give the impression of being open and free, this liberal. Yeah, so they have, a lot of them said that a lot of people think that the Green Party is restricting their freedom. So this is why they did not vote for the Greens, but for the Liberals. So, and this is one point, and the other point is that a lot of people,
you mean in their program, they feel like it's because of their propositions, or
their propositions and the way they present themselves. The way they present themselves. They have been, like Axel just said, there have been made some mistakes, and there are of course misconceptions, and the social media was very keen on grabbing anything which has to be, which in German we say Verbotspartei, which a lot of people say the Green Party is the party who will, really restrict our freedom and make a lot of, requirements about environmental things, and so people were like kind of deterred by that. And I think the conservative youth, which of course there is part of the youth is conservative, they have always voted for the CDU. The conservatives, but the CDU is in such deplorable state that they said, okay, we cannot vote for the CDU, but we have to vote conservative, so we will go for the FDP, for the liberals. So this was for me a big surprise that so many young people voted for the. But I think which both parties, the Greens and the Liberals, have in common is change of politics, change of parameter. So I think they want. A lot of young people want to have something fresh, new people, not these old white men reigning the country now for so many years. Okay, Angela Merkel was not an old white man, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. Florian, if I just sort of like from an outsider's perspective, it seems like, we have on the one hand a desire for change in Germany, but also people want everything to stay the same. So there's seemingly this sort of like it doesn't really make any sense. On the one hand, people want stability, and then people also want, especially young people, sort of itching after 16 years of the Merkel government to change. And what do you think explains this irritation, maybe or impatience for young people to sort of say, like, what can we change? Do they felt like these Merkel years as being too stultifying, or what in your view is sort of the issue here?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the same chancellor was there for so long. I would suggest no matter who it is, really, 16 years is a very long time. I think that Merkel became known to be, maybe that's a German stereotype, but she's very analytical, maybe a little bit slow to take decisions, right? Not necessarily a risk taker. So I think that's maybe, but extremely intelligent and analytical. So I think that many people were or are hoping for change to come out, be maybe a little bit more risk-taking or a little bit more open to change. And I think specifically with regards to technological advances and climate change, and maybe we will speak a lot about that later on, but I think these are 2 points where maybe specifically young voters, but also others think that Germany is maybe strong, powerful, and wealthy, but not so much with the program at the moment.
Do we, Axel, if I may ask you again, so if we see this, okay, people sort of demand certain changes, and also like they probably indicate that maybe with the Liberals and the Greens, who will in all likelihood form part of a future government coalition, that they might be more willing to press for these changes. Where do you sort of see most of these changes happening? What are sort of like the big challenges that Germany needs to tackle? And are they being, in your opinion, are they really being addressed?
Yeah, the big changes, if we look at the outcome of these elections, and the strong role that the Greens and the Liberals have played for particularly among the younger spectrum, it points right at 2 core issues, where the Greens and the Liberals are actually going quite well along each other. They fundamentally have at least the same objectives, and one is the policy of everything around things digitalization, that Germany needs to become much better with regard to the new technologies. And it's a constant complaint that Germany is lagging behind in terms of digitalization. We had a huge problems last year when COVID started, that the school system is not seriously prepared to do virtual teaching and so on. Is very, I mean, that is a thing where young people feel, particularly young people, but also broader society feels that something really needs to be done. And then, of course, the other thing is climate change. The Greens have said very clearly climate change is the single most important thing we have to address with, and on many levels, not just emission reduction, but it affects all sectors of society. It affects our way of life, everything. Interestingly, the Liberals have, in 2017, they were still pretty, I mean, climate policy didn't play a role for them. They have changed by now, and they say climate change is important for them as a policy issue. The interesting thing is the difference where the Greens and the Liberals are differing is about methodology, and there we see a classical positioning between right and left, between market orientation on the Liberal side versus more state interventionist, restrictive. I mean, I wouldn't call it the Verbotspartei, but there's a clear more reliance on the side of the Greens that the state, that the government really has to steer, has to regulate stronger. Whereas the Liberals would always say, let's set emission targets and let's do carbon pricing and then let the market rule the things. Yeah. So these 2 topics, interestingly, both these parties are are not in unison. There will be huge debates going on right now in the negotiations. As we talk here, the tripartite talks have just started in Berlin, I think an hour ago, where for the first time they sit together with the three parties and trying to hammer out the starting points for such a coalition. I think these are two major challenges. The other big challenge, and that is what the Social Democrats are standing for, is the social question. Yeah? The liberals have no image of being very supportive to social justice issues, obviously. They are market-oriented. They come from the middle class. They're from a relatively well-off middle class. The Greens, and that is the problem of the Greens have in their agenda a pretty good social program dealing with issues of really the classical bread and butter social justice issues. I mean, how to creating a minimum wage or setting up the higher, increasing the minimum wage and so on, the labor market issues, better payment. But the Greens also being, at least from its voters, very much a middle class party with a very similar social profile as the liberal, or like the liberals, yeah, they are not really seen as being very strong in this respect. And then people have gone, in this election, it's so stunning to see, people have gone back and want classical social security, social justice politics, and have been voting for the Greens, for the Social Democrats, who seem to promise this now in this situation. And there's actually then, in a way, this has an element of continuity. I mean, it's back to old topics, which are, I think, increasingly relevant again, because the social issue never disappeared. It was just kind of perhaps driven out of the main narrative, out of the big political debates, but it is very important. And Olaf Scholz, the head of the Social Democratic Party, of course, appears to be able to guarantee a certain type of continuity, both with regard to these social issues, as well as with the political style of Angela Merkel. So it's a super ambivalent picture that we have. We have a lot of continuity on the one side, a lot of pressure to do things in a new way, and it is an interesting combination that this planned, what is it called, the traffic light coalition, no? The red for the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the yellow for the Liberals, that this is hopefully going to emerge. I think for now, I would say, majority of Germans would say that this is currently our best hope to drive some things forward. All types of conflict are to be foreseen, but I think right now there's a serious will to get this done.
I want to bring in Alistair. For the first time in Germany, there were 3 candidates standing for the chancellery, and that also meant that the media format was new, and they had these triels. They were called not a duel, but like a triel, because like basically this trio of the main candidates coming up there. They had 3 of those, and I sort of watched in as best as I could. But what really struck me was that basically like the world outside of Germany did not come up at all. It was all domestic politics. There was just almost no mention of Europe. There was no mention of France. There was no mention of what goes on in other European countries, let alone the world. There was a little bit on Afghanistan on the sides, but there was basically a total absence of foreign and security policy. Why do you think Germany, or this campaign in particular, was so inward-looking?
Thanks, Roland. I mean, it's always struck me, you know, I think when I look at Germany, I think I'm a looker on, you know. I'm not a looker within, I'm a looker on. I say that because it goes back quite a long time, but I wrote, we did a seminar, so when I just started my academic career, I did a seminar series, we had a seminar series on unification. And it was with Eva Kalinski at Kiel University, and it was 1990 to 1991. Absolutely fascinating. And in a sense, those questions, I mean, the questions about the role of Germany in Europe, the role of Germany between Europe and the US, the role of the reunified Germany, these were questions that were posed pertinently then. And I think they're questions that have always stayed with us, you know. I think in a sense, when we look at Germany looking on, I think we see quite clearly, we see different perspectives because different countries have different takes on the nature of the relationship with Germany, obviously. But I think in a sense, what we see, if there's a sort of common theme, it's that Germany, which, you know, Germany is clearly the preeminent economic power in Europe. It's a power with some, it's a country with some extremely powerful business interests and so on. It looks after its own interests pretty well, really, in China, in Russia, in other places. So, you know, let's not be naive here. There's a degree of realism in German position as well. But I think the general consensus is that, you know, there's a lack of ability, perhaps, to perform the role that would be consistent or cognate, really, with the economic influence of Germany. And I think so. If we look at Germany's various partners, be it actually France or the US or other countries, this is the theme that often comes back. The French, let's take the French, because, you know, I am primarily a France expert. It's clear that Macron, it doesn't, you know, prolonged negotiations for a coalition would not actually favor Macron's interests much, because he wants to get moving quickly. He wants the French presidency of the EU to be a success, and he wants Germany to be sort of co-steering that with him. So from the Macron perspective, following those negotiations closely is important. He doesn't particularly want Lindner to be the finance minister and so on. That links up with, I suppose, the multifaceted nature of this relationship, because clearly we might say that in practical terms in Europe, you know, Germany's been the power broker being quite a good description in a way, because if we look at the varied interests within the European Union, it's not even the Franco-German coalition alliance. It's actually Germany who is able, or who has been able over the Merkel period, to essentially square the circle of those very competing and very different interests within Europe. So I think that the next German Chancellor will maybe have a slightly hard act to follow to start with, but to continue to square the circle at the European level, I think will be one of the main tasks. I think there is that bigger question about, you know, if we're talking about European strategic autonomy and so on, then, you know, some big questions have to be answered, and particularly in relation to the role of Germany and others in terms of commitments to security and defense in a way that, you know, is there, you know, I'm taking Macron's perspective for the moment. Is there a way in which Germany, for example, could be more strategically tied into questions of a more European strategic autonomy? That will certainly be a question that will be in people's minds. Just a couple more minutes. I think really the other question, it is striking, of course, that foreign policy, Europe was not very present in the election campaign. It's striking and, in a sense, slightly worrying, actually, to be honest, slightly worrying. Because it's true that picking up the pieces at the moment does require, almost in a common European interest in a way, it requires a pretty strong, active Germany that is able to, in a sense, to get over its past in some respects. And I think particularly, say, the relations with Hungary, for example, you know, perhaps being a little bit less indulgent with some of the practices on rule of law taking place in other parts of the EU. So I won't say any more than that. There's such a lot to talk about on this question, but I'll just stay there for a moment.
Great. I want to ask one more question before opening up and inviting questions from our attendees here in the room, but also from our participants on the Zoom call, and that has to deal with immigration. You know, looking back over the Merkel years, it strikes me that it's like immigration is maybe one of the big changes that has taken place in German society, and it was a very prominent issue in the 2017 election, and also propelled the far right AfD party to a very strong electoral result. This time around, they've lost a little bit of their support, roughly about 15 to 16%. But again, immigration was largely absent. And my question is basically to all panelists, whoever wants to answer that, is like, why was immigration, you know, 4 years ago was such a hot potato, and now it basically wasn't. And you know, so how can we deal with that? You know, what is immigration doing in Germany and to its politics? Florian, and then Katrin, maybe?
It's maybe a sign that Germany dealt with that quite well. It didn't come up again, and I mean, in 2015, I think Germany took in more than 1 million migrants, and I'm glad it did. And I think that's something that, I mean, in hindsight, I think was maybe not such a big problem. I mean, people always fear, of course, change, and Germans in particular. So I think I was really, in some ways, happy that it didn't play a big role now. And then, of course, BioNTech is basically founded by immigrant children. So that's never said in world politics, but that well-supported immigrant children save the world in 2020 is quite amazing. And I think these stories, in a way, need to be played up, because I'm sure there are many, many more, right? And they came, of course, 2 generations ago and not in 2015, but nonetheless, there may be more generations to follow with well-educated, brilliant people that are not of German descent.
Katrin?
Actually, I think I totally agree. I think by and large the immigration, so-called the refugee crisis, whatever crisis means, more or less is solved. There of course there are some problems, but this is totally normal. But in general, it's done very well. But still, I would not underestimate this thing, because we have not talked about the AfD, who in the east part of Germany has, in some regions, up to 30% of the votes. Which is, and I think the division is not so much between what you suggested, like in city and countryside, rural, urban division, but the division is really still east and west. And this is, I think, a very, very, very painful, painful thing to happen 30 years after unification. So the AfD is, I mean, today I just looked at the districts, and there, like I said, there is in some parts of East Germany they're like 30%, and there in West Germany they're like 0% or like 2%. So what happened? What is there? So we are saying, okay, the refugees, everything is okay, no problems, but obviously that's not true, because the AfD, a lot of the identity of the AfD is still the fear of refugees, of foreigners, of migration. Even though in the eastern part, a lot of them have not, they are not, but anyway, but still, the fear is there. You have to take it serious. We cannot just go over and think, okay, now 20% for the, like if you see if this in this picture, you see the blue are the AfD, and they're in Saxony and Thuringia.
Yeah, for those, I mean, it's a good point. I just had written it down. So, there is indeed a stark difference in across the performance of the parties in different parts of. Like AfD actually became the strongest party in both the states of Saxony and in Thuringia. You can see that on that chart behind you. Oh, sorry, it keeps changing. In those 2 states, with roughly about 24-point-something%. And in 2 other states, in Brandenburg and in Mecklenburg, Pomerania, it came up with 18% and thus became the second political force in those 2 states. Whereas in most West German states, the support is much significantly lower. And yeah, Axel.
I want to throw, how do you say, a spanner into the wheel regarding the refugee issue, because I think it was this was really a crisis in 2015. It was perceived as a crisis. It was solved. I mean, it was kind of solved in that setting. There was huge support for refugees in Germany to help, but it also started to split the society, and the split was emerging rather rapidly in 2016 and in 2017, and explained the rapid rise of the AfD, of the right-wing populist. The solution of the Merkel government was of course not to continue to remain welcoming to refugees, but basically making it difficult for people to reach Germany. And we should be very frank about it. I mean, what happened after the 2015 crisis was basically the closing of the influx through Turkey. There was an agreement with Turkey about that the Turkey would not would basically keep refugees coming from the Middle Eastern region towards Central Europe. So I mean, by a very tough, basically policy intervention, the Merkel government basically reduced the stream of refugees maybe not to a trickle. I mean, we still get numbers of refugees. I don't even know what are the numbers right now per year, but it has been much reduced. So it has been managed, but it has obviously been managed in a way that Germans feel comfortable with it. Whether it's actually fair, a different matter. I mean, we can discuss this a lot. Then let's come to the AfD in this context. The AfD actually grew. It really fed on. It fed on this situation. We should never forget the AfD was not founded as an East German regional party. It actually started as a party that was where some kind of conservative critics of the EU, particularly of the introduction of the euro as a joint currency, where these people assembled and started to build up a certain followership. This was already trickling down until 2015, when suddenly the refugee issue, the migration issue became so hot. Then the AfD gained a lot. Interestingly, different from trends in other parts of Europe, the right-wing populism in general, if you look at the overall figures, is not making much inroads in Germany anymore. It's not expanding, it's actually slightly reducing. We have this, there's a certain base on it, 10% all over. But it's actually quite a difference probably to France, where there is a real risk of a very, very strong outcome for the right-wing populists very soon. And the fact that they became an Eastern regional party is a little bit strange, because there's very little money of the how do you say, the percentage of refugees of migrants in the East is pretty low. So it is basically also a party of a regional. It has become a party that expresses regional discontent. I mean, about migration policy, about being neglected, about being still 30 years after reunification, still being kind of, in some ways, symbolically or really been treated as second-class kind of part of the country. Also, the AfD combines all those forces who were critical of the COVID policies, the COVID lockdown policies in the West. Yeah, so this has combined with a strong regional identity issue in the East, and it has interestingly really taken away a lot of votes from the left party, because the classical left party, which we didn't talk about yet, who actually lost dramatically, they just managed to remain in parliament, in the federal parliament. The left party used to be the strongest party with a regional Eastern identity, and that is dissolving very rapidly. And the left party is in a fundamental crisis. And the AfD has taken over pretty much of their vote over the last, let me say, 6, 7, 8 years.
We're about halfway through, and I would just like to invite our attendees to raise any questions if you have. Please, if you do, please switch on the microphone in front of you so our participants on Zoom can also hear. Yes, Emily, please. And please speak closely to the microphone.
I try.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Roland. I have actually 2 questions related to your introductory comment you mentioned about foreign policy. And I'd like to know, whoever in the panel wants to answer that, what are the implications of these elections in the Germany-China relations? That's my first question. My second question, maybe more for Alistair, is about how this German election may inspire or not the French election and the French Socialist Party. Every time we have elections, socialist parties look at how Germany is doing, trying to revive themselves, whether this is going to happen or not. So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Please.
Okay, so about this China-German relation, I think it is very unclear in a way. I mean, we all know that they have a big problem that, like, I think it's a year ago that they threw out Rainer Bütikofer, a very prominent Green Party member. And so I think the Greens are always very critical towards China. And the Liberals, to be honest, they don't really have a big, identity about this. But they are market-based, so they will always go for the economy. This is what I think, right? So they are building a coalition, and they have to make a lot of compromises. The economy, like you know, is very, very strong and will stay strong. And I think there is one thing compromising between these 3 parties, and the other one is compromising between the needs or the requirements of the economy and the corporate world, and like the moral disaster or the moral dilemma we are in. So, in my opinion, it's totally unclear what will happen with these three parties and with this new government in the relation of China. There are a lot of issues in there already. So, please.
Thanks for the question, Emily. That was a great question. Two great questions, actually. Two bits to your question. So two parts to my answer. No, I mean, I would just say something, first of all, on the China-Germany issue. It's clearly fascinating that, in a way, the comprehensive agreement on investment, which Germany is really, really pushing for, I think, is the most important country pushing for that, sort of fell flat. Well, obviously, the European Parliament was refusing to ratify this, and in a way, that was quite symptomatic, I think, of two things. One, how German, if you like, hard interests are pursued. They're often pursued via the European Union or via different alliances. I mean, I think it's interesting what Axel was saying about migration, because in a way, the key decision, the key deal actually was a deal done but was really done by Merkel, and Merkel then imposed, if you like, I mean, the policy was Europeanized. But we do see quite a familiar pattern. You know, we do clearly see German leaders defending key interests, and why shouldn't they? But coming back to the French situation, which is, I wouldn't say is a bit more rocambolesque, although I'd like to, but I've got my mask on and I can't pronounce it properly. But I think the thing with the French situation that's fascinating is, I mean, in a way, it would almost be quite nice, nostalgically speaking, to think that the success of the Social Democrats in Germany would sort of spill through or filter down. I have big doubts about that, actually, in the French case. I mean, I think I have to be careful what one says, but I think that the French Socialist Party as an institution is probably, as an institution, as a party anyway, or as a political movement. I think I think it has definitively sort of not disappeared. It's transformed into a strong municipal party, a strong regional party. It might perform a role in the future in a progressive government, but I think it's difficult to imagine the PS being revived in any sense. I think, to be fair, which of course leaves open, and again going back to one of Axel's comments, I mean, in a way, the French presidential election we're not talking about today. All come to HKBU, however, after, because we're going to do a session on the French presidential election afterwards. So do come. I'm getting get your diaries in advance.
Save the date.
But it's clearly interesting that well, what strikes me, just to compare the two, is that what we don't have in Germany, I mean, in a sense, it's very interesting, the results of this election. We have clearly a shifting of fortunes between CDU, the SPD. We have two parties that have existed for a long time, the FDP and the Greens, performing rather well. And we have Die Linke performing very poorly. But what we don't have an equivalent to, say, the French in 2017, when actually the old party system just exploded. And it hasn't come back. And if we, and so I think in a sense, the comparative dimension, I think is a useful one here.
May I just take the opportunity to ask a question here from the chat? We have one question about the party that actually was in power for the last 16 years, the CDU, which we've not really spoken about. The CDU has done incredibly well under the leadership of Angela Merkel. Now she is departing from the scene, and so the attraction of the CDU seems to have waned quite a bit. So the question is basically, what direction will the CDU take, assuming in particular that they go into opposition? Will they continue of a path of moderation, or will they try to attempt to reunite the conservative and the right wing, and sort of, so will they stay on a more social democratic course, or will they go on a right wing course? That is one of the questions here for our panelists. Who would like to tackle it? Florian, why don't you give it a go?
Who knows? I think it depends a lot on the there's a leadership struggle in the party, right? So I think we need to, that was very obvious in the election, that cost them the election. I think it's a little bit like after Helmut Kohl's departure, that so many years with the same government, and so there's maybe a void within and desire outside for change. But I think we have to see what happens to Laschet and to what really happens to the party leadership to see where they go. Whether opposition or not, I think just, I don't know. We'll have to wait, I think.
So please,
I think we can still even not be sure.
can you please use the microphone?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, yeah. I think we can still not be sure, entirely sure, that the CDU will be out of power. I mean, we should not take this for granted. I mean, it's unlikely, but there's no guarantee for this. If for some reason this traffic light coalition model fails, then a Jamaica coalition, well, which would be between what we call Jamaica coalition in Germany, between the CDU and the Liberals and the Greens, is also very unlikely, because the reason why traffic light would fail would be some conflict between Greens and Liberals. That is the possible breaking point. Then what would it be left with? A chance for a grand coalition again, this time under SPD leadership. Is unlikely, but is not entirely impossible. Yeah? So we should take this into account. I think apart from that, I think there's big confusion in the CDU. There is a certainly a wide sense that renewal in opposition would be the proper thing to do right now. And whether they would go towards the middle or whether they would try to get to get a larger share on the political right is very difficult to say. You also have so many different tendencies within the CDU, yeah, and then there is the CSU, the Bavarian part of it. It's technically a separate party, which always had as its agenda not to allow any kind of sizable right-wing group in their state of Bavaria. They have failed in recent years to do this, but they may try this again. So it's very difficult. I think that's clearly too early to say at this point.
Don't be shy to ask questions, otherwise I'll take them from the
and
chat.
maybe to add
Yes,
to
yeah,
that,
please.
if you think of the different candidates that the CDU was discussing over the last, I don't know, 12 months or whatever, very, very different people, right? So I think the confusion, since you used that term, that's really it. Because, for example, Merz, completely different. I mean, I think it really depends now who will take the reins within, and then how they, as you said, how they form the coalition.
Martin, please.
Party's leadership, people like Walter Boyans and Esken, they would probably point to their great idea in 2019 of this social state idea. But if you look at it, it's pretty conventional. Things like Grundrente, Kurzarbeitergeld, Mindestlohn, this kind of thing. It wasn't attractive at that time. So I was wondering, is it more about, I think some of you also mentioned to other candidates making mistakes, like laughing at the wrong place at the wrong time. Misogyny as well, I think rightly pointed out. Could it be also explained by this COVID effect, making voters being conscious of how important this social security, things that are not attractive, but they are very helpful when there are crises.
I think, yeah, may I? Just shortly. I think it is really captured in the core phrase that Olaf Scholz has been using, and that is respect. And this is a thing that emerged out of the COVID crisis, where everybody suddenly realized, okay, we have essential services, people providing essential services who have to function under all conditions, and they are pretty badly paid in most cases. And I mean, this motive, yeah, that there is suddenly a rising awareness. I think you pointed very right to this. Since last year, this climate has really changed. and there is more readiness to go for classical, as I said, classical bread and butter issues of social justice and social fairness. Maybe we should not even use social justice, just fairness. And this has driven up the votership of the Social Democrats. Plus, of course, the fact of their chancellorship candidate. He may be a bit boring, but people trust him. And he's an experienced person. I mean, he has also, like every politician, there's some kind of, maybe not skeletons in the closet, but certain situations where he hasn't performed very well in some scandal around tax fraud and so on. But at least he personally, I mean, he's integer. He may not have always functioned 100%.
That's what the CDU tried at the end, right? By trying some skeletons in the closet, maybe didn't help.
But they didn't work. I mean, that was in this Triel situation, which you mentioned, our German TV roundtables. They were trying to hit him with this, but it didn't mention, because I mean he has a statesmanship-like appearance, and he is kind of. Many people are joking that he's basically just Merkel again. It's Merkel 2.0, right? And in a way, when it comes to trust issues, when it comes to a certain kind of being. I mean, not spreading any sense of panic, not being aggressive, being totally integrative in his approach. That is what many Germans, perhaps not the younger generation, right? The younger generation voted differently, yeah. But what many middle-aged or older Germans really wanted to see, and this combination, I think, the COVID experience, plus the strengths of Olaf Scholz against the other candidates. I mean, Laschet, the CDU candidate, had obvious weaknesses. And Annalena Baerbock was just, I mean, I think most Germans were just not used enough to the idea that a 40-year-old woman from the Greens could become chancellor. I think this just is too early. I think that is what probably many people would say.
Thanks. Yeah,
but the rise of the Social Democrats is actually amazing.
Florian?
I just want to add to that. I think that also in recent years with Merkel, the CDU moved so much to the center that I think it's a phenomenon that Scholz can publicly make himself the successor of somebody in a different party. I mean, I can't remember that happening before, but the parties are so much in the center. And I mean, in a way, I'm happy that the extreme right and extreme left lost out so much. It's a really interesting time sign in these times, right, where many countries go the opposite way. But that Scholz can just stand up and say he is the follower of Merkel when they have traditionally a completely different voter base. It's amazing. I mean, I think that's really a sign how Germany, or how the CDU under Merkel and the perception changed in the last few years.
Perhaps there's a practical use of that joke when during Merkel's time that she's the best social democratic chancellor, right? So now the successor, it makes sense.
They have accused her of social democratization of the CDU, and now it works the other way.
Right. May I introduce a question here from our chat? And that's a question I think that I would like to direct firstly at Alistair, and it's about the eurozone. And it says, one of the main projects at the eurozone level is completing the so-called banking union, which transfers powers from the national banking authorities to European-wide institutions, in particular the European Central Bank. It has been introduced slowly in the wake of the debt crisis, but Germany has been particularly reticent to the idea. The eurozone is also due to update its debt and fiscal rules in 2022 because the rules have been on occasion broken, with various nations reporting a debt ratio above 60% of GDP. I think everybody except Luxembourg at the moment is above 60% of GDP, so it's been broken quite widely. And then the last bit, let me just scroll down. Do you think the new coalition government will support tighter fiscal policy across the bloc, in particular with regard to the debt ceiling?
It's a great question, or it's a series of great questions, of course, because there's quite a lot in there. What strikes me, actually, is, to some extent, we haven't talked thus far much about budgetary policy, about the debt brake, about ordoliberalism, about all of these things. We haven't much touched on them because they're extremely difficult questions. But the way, just to sort of think back over the COVID crisis, and I'm not sure I'm the best qualified here to talk about this, but to think back on this, what do we see? We see actually some key German tenets, if you like, in macroeconomic policy, and particularly in terms of monetary policy in the European Union. We see them being challenged, and actually we see them being considerably watered down, you know. I mean, it was very, very interesting. What happened really, you know, with the European Commission going directly to the bond markets, raising the 750 billion, which is actually 808 billion, whatever. But we see, I mean, in a sense, that was, I mean, clearly at the beginning the Germans were very reticent about that. But they you know, to some extent Merkel went along with that. Merkel sort of agreed, and that in itself, I think we have to say, is that the tipping point in a way? Was that the tipping point that gave, if you like, the European Commission the instrument, or the European Union, if you like, the instrument to go and perhaps in a very, very powerful way shift the balance between the EU and the States? And I suppose in a way, what strikes me at the moment, what's interesting politically, of course, is the FDP. Lindner, if he becomes finance minister, then clearly he said very publicly that, you know, they have to restore the debt brake, have to make sure that there's a fiscal tightening at the level of the EU and so on. But I wonder whether it's possible, actually. You might say it's necessary, or some people might say it's necessary in terms of various currency dynamics and so on. But I mean, I think in a way, is it actually possible to do that? It's a difficult one to call, I think. So I think that's actually the area to look at, because that also spills over, into the inter-European dimension. Because clearly, to some extent, Germany has been in a very powerful position to call the shots for a very long time on questions relating to the euro. And if you think, what was that initial trade-off? The initial trade-off was Deutschmark against, against support for German unification, in a way, to put it very crudely. And so I think, in a sense, what we've seen in the COVID crisis, we really have seen some key German policy preferences being called into question. And in a sense, that feeds on to a second set of observations, which is, how does the new Germany, I don't really want to use that phrase, but you know, the new government in Germany, how would the new government in Germany see its role in this new context? You know, is it to sort of resist, to try and go to turn the clock back in a way? Because I think it is, in a sense, turning the clock back. If there's to be a real emphasis on going back to the debt brake and so on, and going back to the making sure that no one goes over 60% of debt. So I think it's a critical moment. I don't know the answer, but it's clearly the one to look out for. And it will play out also in European policy, because clearly there's a powerful coalition of European states that want precisely to carry on in the same recent direction, and want essentially the capacity for that sort of fiscal and budgetary instrument at the European level.
Stefan, you also have a question? Yeah. Please use the microphone, because the people online cannot hear, so please make sure the microphone is switched on.
I just want to challenge...
You need to be closer. You need to be closer.
I just want to challenge what Dr. Sievers said about the Social Democrats, that of course the performance of Social Democrats appeared rather surprising, and they ended up as the strongest party. But historically, and that is an interesting aspect that the panel might want to comment on, historically the Social Democrats haven't done that well. I just checked, it's like the third worst result in post-war history. So what we have seen is the collapse of both mainstream parties, both major parties. That's the legacy of Merkel's rule for 16 years, that her own party collapsed more badly than the Social Democrats. And so with respect to CDU, I do wonder whether their choice of candidate was right from their perspective. That was really not a good choice. But that also Social Democrats, I mean, it was commented on that Scholz was clever to present himself as the inheritor of Merkel's legacy. But the real story is that those two Volksparteien, those two kind of people's parties, have been dramatically diminished as the result, I think, as a result largely of this grand coalition that reduced the profile of both parties. So what we have seen is the fragmentation of the party landscape. And I don't think it's bad for democracy, for German democracy. It's good that there is a real possibility of more significant change, but it is an interesting phenomena, perhaps worth commenting on, the decline of major parties.
Axel, can I invite you first? Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No disagreement. I mean, in the long run, you are very right, of course. I mean, we have the hollowing out of the people's parties, the Volksparteien, over the last decades already. But this is a long-term process. That is, I mean, this is going on over the last 15 years already, yeah. And but measured by the standards, what the SPD, the Social Democrats expected to get, and what about the fate of social democratic parties in other countries of Europe, yeah. This is measured by that standards. It's pretty much a success that is happening there. The Grand Coalition, of course, it has reinforced these problems, but of course we also have to read the Grand Coalition as a result of the process of hollowing out of the big parties. Otherwise, there was a Grand Coalition would never have been possible, right?
Yes, yeah, I think, of course, the Grand Coalition did their share, but on the other hand, there have been evolved these new parties which a new agenda, right? The Green Party has a very strongly new, at that time, new agenda. Then there was a unification, there was a Left Party, which has a very strong, base. And then the AfD had a very strong, so I think it's not that there are new interests, new subjects, new topics, which has evolved and have, been put into different parties. So it's not only Merkel and the Green Party. Like I said, it's a long process.
Do we have more questions? Please. Yes, please. Please use the microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure whether that I missed it, but I think the question of German-China relationship wasn't really answered. And I wanted to, because I think the FDP and the Green Party, they both agree on a very critical position toward China, and they have been very attentive to the political situation in Hong Kong in 2019. So I was just wondering whether there will be a sea change in German politics toward the China relationship.
Just to say very shortly, I think there might be, but I think very strong power is not in this case the parties, but the economy, and which will push these parties, and especially the liberals, if they are in government. I could imagine, I don't know, but I could imagine that they are, stepping back towards from their critical positions, because they kind of want to serve the corporate world as well. But of course, we will see. And this, what the SPD, we will see. I don't know.
So.
My sense would be just a little bit different. I would see rather the SPD in a position to, let me say, defend the interests, defend the interests of what as the relevant German economic interests vis-à-vis China. The problem is, I agree with the point that both the Greens and the Liberals have, for human rights reasons, have very strong, there are pretty strong views in both parties, and this will, everybody senses this, that there's a certain degree of coziness that Angela Merkel had developed in her China relationships, not entirely neglecting the human rights issues, but being extremely careful with it. That this time has ended. And I sense this when I read the German side, and also sense this when I read the South China Morning Post. It's everywhere. Everybody expects a change. How much this will happen, we don't know yet, but there is going to be a change. We should not forget one thing. There is also, I think, a certain change in the perception by German businesses. The German business community, the big one, that has really thrived very well over the last 2 decades in the China business, is increasingly ambivalent about it. There are still companies for whom China is a big business and who want to continue as they did before. But then there are others who see that they have been being maybe manipulated, that their technologies has been kind of taken away, that they have been involved in deals which have not been profitable for them. So there's also a growing, I mean, and this is not very recent, this is a matter of at least the last 2-3 years, at least, a tendency to be, even in the business community, to look more critically at this China engagement. Yeah, so it is, there's clearly, I mean, changes are to be expected. How this will play out in detail is, again, is difficult to say. But it will not continue the Merkel style, except if Olaf Scholz does the Merkel again and just continues in this way. Of course, it's theoretically possible, but, well, we don't know.
Florian?
Actually, I think it also depends a little bit on China. I mean, if the economy booms and they want to buy luxury cars, then no, I mean, honestly, I think that does matter. If that slows down, yes, then the other, I mean, all the critical comments or the thinking that you brought forward, that becomes more important, right? And I really see, I mean, the economy is thriving with China, but if that would change one day, then that will also influence the relationship, I think.
Now, of course, sorry, please, Alistair.
No, I think it's an excellent question, and obviously, you know, you pointed out we didn't really answer your question. Fair enough, because it's actually a very difficult question to answer. You know, I'll try and give even a different spin on the question. You could say what's interesting in this coalition formation will be the fact that there's going to be, in a sense, there'll be a pivotal party. Okay, and you could say that in a way, probably the Liberals, the FDP, are actually the pivotal party in a way, because maybe the Greens are as well. But I mean, in a sense, the party that can make the difference between the different coalitions, which is either the Greens or the Liberals. Now, both of those parties are, in a sense, critical in relation to China. So how will that play out in the context of a new coalition is, I think, a very interesting question. It might well be the case that it's the SPD that really represents the business community and so on, but the pivotal party can actually perform a role that's more important than its sort of mathematical weight in a coalition. And so let's see. You know,
I would like to, we could, following on from this line of inquiry, almost like we can also ask about what's going to happen in the relationship between Germany and the United States. That's also something that did not come up. And over the last few years, the United States saw sort of Germany, Merkel's Germany, as sort of like the main partner in Europe. After Brexit, that perception has only grown stronger. But do we really see an appetite for revitalization of that transatlantic relationship in Germany, or more a distancing, as we're seeing in France, where there's been quite a lot of disillusionment with the structural trends happening, pushing almost the United States and Europe further apart? Any views on this?
I have views, obviously.
Please.
Now, I think what's interesting here is just trying to limit myself to Germany, because it's true that is, in a sense, the controversy over the AUKUS. You know, I mean, clearly, what's interesting there is that it's a spat, I suppose, between France and its allies, in a way, UK, US, Australia. It's also very economically based. It's framed in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy, because clearly, I mean, France has an Indo-Pacific strategy. The European Union has an Indo-Pacific strategy, as the head of office repeated just a few days ago. So, I mean, in a sense,
which was announced on the same day that the Americans announced the New Deal.
Exactly, was announced. But in a way, the absent here, not genuinely absent, but the absent voice is the voice of Germany, actually. You know, it seems to me that we've not really heard the German voice very loudly in relation, not just to this particular conflict.
Do you think it was a mistake when President Macron of France decided to recall their ambassadors, that Germany did not follow suit?
Not necessarily, no, because recalling the ambassador, it's a very national act, and it's very much it's a sort of it's a very symbolic national fact. So no, I don't think it was a mistake personally, but I think it does pose just trying to focus in on the Germany. That really is one of the key questions that any future German government's going to have to settle, you know. And I think there's still a case that Germany is caught somewhere between Paris and Washington, if you like. There's still that case, and I'm not really sure that. I mean, if there's to be more genuine European strategic autonomy, that might or might not be a good thing. That's not my argument today. But if there is to be more European strategic autonomy, then clearly a country like Germany has to sort of participate more, perhaps, in European foreign policy affairs or security policy, rather.
Okay. Yeah.
I think one thing which really shook a lot of German politicians and German public up is the Afghanistan thing. That, you know, Afghanistan was, and, you know, as part of the NATO, we joined in and participated in this, and now this whole thing collapsed, and without even talking to us, talking to any of the allies, the United States just went out, right? And just we had to follow suit. So I think this was something which really annoyed people, you know, and just like made it very open that what the United States-European relation is. But again, I think the relation depends a lot about how the United States will behave, right? How the United States will be. But I think the Afghanistan thing really clearly showed what character this whole NATO and relation has. So I think this might be something which will be taken into consideration in the future, in the close future, in the near future.
I would, in the interest of time, I would like to take one more question from the chat, and then maybe have a last question from here, from the audience. We have another question here in the chat that says, we've seen a shift from people voting for persons rather than parties and programs. Do you think future elections will continue to lack on content on real discussion or important issues? So basically about the personalification of politics. Is that a trend that we will see continuing? Or
I'll give a take on that. I think it's always actually extremely difficult to distinguish between personality and program. It's easier in some electoral systems or some electoral setups. It's rather easier, you know. I mean, we'll talk about the French, but I mean, in a way, the French system on the second round is clearly two programs, but it's also two individuals fighting very much on image. I think in the German case, I don't know really whether we can really. I mean, Martin's very good comments before were all about, in a sense, you know, shifting policy agendas. They were about shifting forms of solidarity under COVID and putting, in a way, the social democratic policy agenda back in the centre of issues. And so, of course, how do you distinguish, in a sense? Of course, you can distinguish between, I suppose, program and personality, but it's actually quite difficult, analytically at least, to distinguish between program and personality. There will always be these tensions, always. Of course, there are aspects of mediatization, as to triennial debates and so on, but they're all mixes of the same sort of tension, I think.
I think
Florian and then Maxwell.
It also has a little bit to do again with that void. I think Merkel took care of so many things that people were just looking for a person this time rather than a party who could do that. But I agree with the person who asked the question. I always thought in Germany it was actually reassuring that people voted for a party, not for a person. But I'm sure we get there again. I hope so.
Please.
I'm not even sure that there is so much of a change. I mean, there has. I mean, you have made this particularly clear. It is actually analytically very difficult to differentiate this. Of course, the personality factor comes in, but every German election, I remember, federal election, but even state-level elections, they are highly personalized also. But the personality can never be separated from programmatic issues. So I don't see really a major fundamental change in this weighing of these two factors. They all can play a role, and sometimes it can be like this Merkel continuity factor, yeah, that is so obvious, and this is a bit surprising, yeah, but it makes sense, and it doesn't drive the Social Democrats away from their political positions. I don't think so. Anyway, the political positions in this grand coalition that existed over the last years, SPD and CDU have been pretty close on many issues. Yeah? So,
One time for one more last question.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, yes. Yes, please. Question.
To the this question about this new German government, whatever it is, Ampel or whatever, Jamaica, its relations with China. I think that there's good reason to expect a certain continuity, no matter which government comes in, when it comes to supporting human rights rather than just other issues like trade or climate change. There has been some speculation that Annalena Baerbock might become the next foreign minister, might be, and I think that there's still personally, I think I expect the Germany continue to be a kind of behind the scene but effective kind of advocate for human rights, not the kind of like trying to drive regime change or either in rhetoric or in action that's not seen as his own mission, but to help those politically persecuted is something that is still shared a kind of value across these parties who are winning the election this time. If the Böll Stiftung's honorable tradition in this regard is a good indicator of what the Green Party will do when it comes to this area, I think we have very good reason to have hope. Thank you.
we will do our very best.
All right.
But it's not easy in this world. Yeah. May I just make one?
Yes,
one,
please.
I mean, since we were tracking the international field, one country that has not been mentioned and which plays pretty much a role in German politics is, of course, Russia. Of course. You see, China. I mean, we should never forget this. Many people, when it comes to foreign policy, of course, France plays a big role. America plays a big role, and many Germans, I think, they would probably wish the old times back, but they know after Trump, they are not going even. With Biden, they are not coming back, so we have to be more active in some way. But China is an economic issue. But I mean, a threat. China is not seen as a threat in any military sense or so for Europe, but Russia is. And now, as we are heading towards winter, and as the gas prices are exploding, there suddenly, since a few days, there's talk that Europe can be blackmailed by Russia, even though the Russians haven't done it, except some former satellites of their own, yeah. But there is this threat, and the military and the military actions and the acts of violence. This is scaring Germans, and the relationship to Russia is within the German party system. Yeah, it's actually pretty much discussed. I mean, the left party and even parts of the Social Democrats have made it part of their agenda to be kind of soft on Russia and say, okay, we need to communicate, we need to be friendly, yeah. Whereas, I mean, in the Greens, certainly among the Greens, there is much criticism of Russia, yeah. And this is going to be also a very, very interesting point. You're looking at it from Hong Kong, this may look a little bit far, but it's very much present in Germany.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for our panelists for their wonderful remarks. I think we have a lot of inspiration and a lot of food for thought here. Thank you all for joining us here in person, and what seems to be becoming a stormy night. And thank you to all the participants online for participating in our discussion. We will be in touch with new updates upon the next joint seminar. We have a number of them planned, but we will circulate and communicate the dates and venues of those in due time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.